When NASCAR Hall of Famer and veteran aviator Mark Martin first heard about the Greg Biffle crash investigation, something didn't sit right. And now, after reviewing the preliminary findings and comparing them to his own decades of flying experience, Martin has publicly stated he's deeply disturbed by what appears to be significant gaps in the official narrative. What Martin sees in this investigation isn't just a tragedy, it's a pattern of inconsistencies that every pilot should be paying attention to. I'm going to walk you through exactly why Martin's concerns matter and why this crash might represent something far more troubling than initially reported. Let me start with what caught Martin's attention immediately. As someone who's logged thousands of hours in similar aircraft, Martin knows the Citation II intimately. When he learned that 3 pilot-rated individuals were aboard, Dennis Dutton, a 67-year-old former Delta captain, his son Jack, and Greg Biffle himself, his first question was the same one every experienced pilot would ask: who was actually flying? Because in aviation, especially in an emergency, that question isn't just about curiosity, it's about understanding the decision-making chain that led to disaster. The official story suggests this was a routine Part 91 flight that encountered some kind of mechanical issue, attempted to return to the field, and tragically fell short of the runway. But Martin points out that almost nothing about this flight was routine. First, you have the unusual crew configuration. Dennis Dutton held the type rating, but required a qualified second in command. His son Jack held only a single-engine private certificate with instrument rating, no multi-engine qualification whatsoever. Biffle had multi-engine privileges, but no type rating. Martin emphasizes this creates what pilots call a fuzzy command structure, and in an emergency, fuzzy kills. What really set off Martin's alarm bells was the missing nose baggage door visible in post-crash photos. Combined with clear foreign object damage to the right engine fan blades, this points to a specific and well-documented failure mode in Citation aircraft. Martin recalls at least 2 similar incidents, one in Barranquilla in 2024, where the crew successfully returned after engine failure from baggage ingestion, and another tragic case in 2007, where crew distraction from an open door led to a stall. But here's what bothers Martin. The NTSB's initial statements made no mention of this critical detail. They simply stated, all 4 corners of the aircraft have been accounted for. Aviation speak that tells you nothing about whether a baggage door was found, where it was found, or when it separated from the aircraft. Martin's particularly troubled by the weather conditions that morning. Official reports show ceilings around 1,200 feet broken with 5-mile visibility and drizzle. That's technically VFR, but what pilots call scud running weather, marginal conditions where you're threading the needle between clouds and terrain. For a crew dealing with an emergency, especially if they lost an engine, those conditions transform from challenging to potentially lethal. Martin questions why, if they were experiencing an emergency serious enough to attempt an immediate return, they didn't declare it with ATC and request an IFR clearance for vectors and approach guidance. This brings us to the audio recording that surfaced several days after the crash, and this is where Martin's concern turns to genuine alarm. The recording, which appeared out of nowhere and was amplified by aviation YouTube channels, purportedly captures the pilot stating they have an issue and are getting everything going, getting our gear down. Martin finds the language bizarre. In his experience, pilots in genuine emergencies are specific. They say engine failure, or fire, or control problem. They don't repeatedly use the vague term issue. And announcing routine actions like lowering landing gear over CTAF, that's simply not done. But what really troubles Martin is the NTSB's response, or lack thereof. In their first press briefing, spokesman Michael Graham stated they were unaware of any emergency declaration. By the second briefing, after being questioned about this, Graham admitted there was clearly an emergency, but seemed to dance around the existence of audio recordings, despite having mentioned them multiple times in the first briefing. Martin sees this as more than bureaucratic caution. He sees it as active misdirection. The data trail makes Martin even more suspicious. Flight Radar 24 shows only 24 data points across the entire 10-minute flight, with a massive 4-minute gap before the final transmission. NTSB exchange shows wildly erratic altitude readings, including an impossible 4,000 foot per minute climb to 4,000 feet. While some have speculated about flight control issues or even a struggle in the cockpit, Martin believes the truth is both simpler and more damning. The aircraft was likely attempting to stay below the cloud deck while maneuvering for an emergency return, putting it below reliable radar and NTSB coverage. Those wild altitude excursions? Probably just terrain masking creating false readings. What the reliable data does show is revealing. The aircraft climbed normally after takeoff, suggesting both engines were initially functioning. Around 2,000 feet, it leveled off and began slowing, exactly what you'd expect if a baggage door had opened and the crew was reducing speed to prevent further damage. But then things get interesting. The aircraft descended about 300 feet while continuing to slow, then suddenly resumed climbing at roughly 1,000 feet per minute while simultaneously accelerating 19 knots. That's significant because a Citation II on one engine can barely maintain level flight at typical weights, let alone climb while accelerating. This suggests to Martin that both engines may still have been producing at least partial power at that point. Martin's most serious concern involves the human factors at play. With 3 pilots aboard, who is responsible for securing that baggage door? In his experience, this is exactly the kind of situation where everyone assumes someone else handled it. The Citation II's nose baggage doors aren't electronically monitored. There's no cockpit warning if they're unlatched. It's purely a visual check, and with 3 pilots, that check apparently fell through the cracks. Martin calls this a classic normalization of deviance, the slow erosion of safety standards that happens when nothing goes wrong for long enough that people stop being careful. The regulatory maze surrounding this flight also troubles Martin deeply. Under Part 91, a second-in-command doesn't need a type rating if they meet certain familiarization requirements. But Martin questions whether anyone actually verified those requirements were met. Was Biffle legally qualified to sit in that right seat? More importantly, was he practically qualified to assist in an emergency? And what about Jack Dutton? If he occupied the right seat, which Martin suspects might have happened given the father-son dynamic, the entire operation was illegal from the moment they closed the door. Martin's particularly critical of how Part 91 operations can create these gray areas. In airline operations, every detail is specified, trained, and checked. In Part 91, especially with older aircraft like the Citation II that can be single-pilot certified under certain conditions, the standards become suggestions. Martin points out that Dennis Dutton wasn't qualified for single-pilot operations, yet the loose structure of Part 91 allowed for a crew configuration that was legal on paper, but potentially dangerous in practice. The trajectory of the final approach haunts Martin. The aircraft was established on what appeared to be a base leg for runway 28, descending through about 1,500 feet, when it crashed 1,800 feet short of the threshold. For an experienced airline captain like Dutton, missing the runway by that margin suggests something catastrophic happened in those final moments. Martin speculates they may have lost their second engine or encountered severe wind shear in the marginal weather, or simply ran out of altitude while trying to stretch a glide they couldn't make. But what disturbs Martin most is what he sees as a pattern of obfuscation by the NTSB. The mysterious audio that appeared days later, the evasive language in press briefings, the failure to address obvious questions about the baggage door, it all points to an investigation that's being managed more for public relations than for safety. Martin notes that the NTSB has a cockpit voice recorder from this aircraft, a lucky break since CVRs aren't required for Part 91. They know exactly who was sitting where, who said what, and when things went wrong. Yet they're choosing to parse their words carefully, leading Martin to wonder what they're trying to hide. The technical aspects of the crash sequence trouble Martin as an experienced citation pilot. The initial climb to 2,000 feet would have taken less than 2 minutes, barely enough time to run a checklist if something went wrong immediately after takeoff. If the baggage door opened and items were ingested into the right engine, the crew would have faced multiple simultaneous challenges: unusual noise and vibration, asymmetric thrust, the need to secure the failed engine, and the immediate decision of where to land. Add marginal weather and an unclear command structure, and you have what Martin calls a perfect storm of task saturation. Martin's also concerned about the investigation's focus on mechanical factors while seemingly ignoring human performance issues. The presence of 3 pilots should have enhanced safety, but Martin suggests it may have had the opposite effect. Without clear role definition, critical tasks can be missed while everyone assumes someone else is handling them. He's seen this phenomenon repeatedly in his racing career. Too many chiefs, not enough Indians, and suddenly, nobody's actually driving the car. The weather factor can't be overstated in Martin's analysis. Those 1,200-foot ceilings meant the crew had minimal vertical maneuvering room while trying to return to the airport. In an emergency, especially with degraded performance from a damaged or failed engine, every foot of altitude becomes precious. Martin calculates they had perhaps 700 feet between the cloud base and terrain. Not enough margin for error when you're dealing with an aircraft that's not performing as expected. What particularly galls Martin is the NTSB's apparent reluctance to address the audio recording's authenticity directly. When investigative authorities won't provide straight answers about evidence that's already public, it erodes trust in the entire process. Martin believes the recording is likely genuine, based on its technical characteristics. But the NTSB's evasiveness makes him wonder if there's something on it they don't want discussed. Perhaps confusion in the cockpit, or evidence of who was actually flying. Martin draws parallels to other aviation accidents where initial reports downplayed human factors, only to have them emerge as primary causes months later. He's particularly reminded of several Part 91 business aviation accidents, where loose operational standards combined with external pressures led to poor decision-making. The presence of a celebrity owner, an aging captain, and an aspiring young pilot creates what Martin calls a soup of social dynamics that can override good judgment. The single pilot exemption issue particularly rankles Martin. The Citation II is certified for single pilot operations, but only with extensive additional training and equipment. Dennis Dutton apparently didn't have that exemption. Yet the informal nature of Part 91 operations means there was no one checking qualifications at engine start. Martin sees this as symptomatic of a larger problem in general aviation: regulations that exist on paper but lack practical enforcement mechanisms. Martin's analysis of the NTSB data leads him to believe the crew attempted what pilots call a tactical pattern, a tight, low pattern to return to the airport as quickly as possible. The problem with tactical patterns is they leave no room for error. If you misjudge your energy state, or encounter unexpected sink, or have further degradation of performance, you can find yourself too low and too slow with nowhere to go. Martin suspects this is exactly what happened in those final seconds. The human cost weighs heavily on Martin's mind. 3 families destroyed, 3 pilots who probably thought they were making reasonable decisions right up until they weren't. But Martin's anger is reserved for what he sees as systemic failures that made this accident possible, even predictable. Inadequate cockpit warning systems for critical doors, fuzzy regulations around crew qualifications, and a Part 91 culture that often prioritizes convenience over safety protocols. Martin's particularly incensed by what he perceives as the NTSB's kid-glove treatment of Part 91 accidents compared to airline incidents. When an airline crew makes an error, it becomes national news and drives industry-wide changes. When a Part 91 crew operates in a gray area and crashes, it's often written off as pilot error without examining the systemic issues that created the situation. Martin sees this double standard as not just unfair, but actively dangerous to the advancement of aviation safety. The certification history of N257BW adds another layer to Martin's concerns. This aircraft previously operated under Part 135, Commercial Charter Standards, where maintenance and operational requirements are stringent. When it transitioned to private Part 91 operations, many of those safeguards fell away. Martin questions whether critical maintenance items, like door latch adjustments and engine intake inspections, receive the same attention under private ownership. Martin's review of similar citation accidents reveals a troubling pattern. The nose baggage door issue isn't new. It's been identified in multiple accidents and incidents over decades. Yet there's still no retrofit requirement for electronic door monitoring, no AD requiring enhanced pilot checks, no standardized procedure for ensuring these doors are secured. Martin calls this bureaucratic inertia at its deadliest, known problems that persist because fixing them would cost money and acknowledge liability. The investigation's timeline troubles Martin as well. The NTSB typically releases preliminary reports within 2 weeks, but their initial statements have been so vague that Martin questions whether the preliminary will contain any substantive information. He's seen this pattern before. When investigations touch on sensitive regulatory or human performance issues, the information flow slows to a trickle. Martin believes the flying public deserves better, especially when the lessons from this crash could prevent future tragedies. What Martin finds most disturbing is what this accident represents for the future of general aviation. As more wealthy individuals purchase sophisticated aircraft for personal transportation, the gulf between their financial capability and their operational expertise widens. Martin sees Greg Biffle as someone who was trying to do things right, earning ratings, flying with experienced pilots, investing in training. Yet the system still failed him. If it can fail someone with Biffle's resources and commitment, what hope is there for less dedicated owners? Martin's ultimate conclusion is harsh but necessary. This accident was preventable at multiple points. Better door design would have prevented the initiating event. Clearer regulations would have ensured proper crew composition. More stringent operational standards would have mandated weather minimums and approach procedures. And a culture that prioritized safety over convenience would have had someone double-checking that baggage door. Instead, multiple small failures aligned to create a catastrophe, and the investigation seems more interested in minimizing blame than maximizing lessons learned. As Martin puts it, in racing, when someone crashes, we don't hide the telemetry. We share it, study it, and make sure it doesn't happen again. Aviation claims to have a just culture focused on learning from mistakes. But this investigation feels more like damage control than truth-seeking. Greg Biffle deserved better. His passengers deserved better. And future pilots deserve better than vague statements and buried audio recordings. Martin's final observation cuts to the heart of why he's speaking out. The Citation II flying today are aging aircraft, many transitioning from commercial to private hands. The pilots flying them are often successful people accustomed to managing complex situations in their professional lives. But aviation doesn't care about your success in other fields. It demands specific knowledge, recent experience, and, above all, respect for its unforgiving nature. When investigations obscure rather than illuminate, when regulations create gray areas rather than clear standards, and when human factors are minimized rather than examined, we set the stage for the next tragedy. This crash didn't have to happen. That's what disturbs Martin most of all.